Dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. The headlights on both ends of my heat day. This country life is for me. Ride with us, HPJ. Ride with us, HPJ.
Well, hey there, folks, and welcome to our second seminar of our virtual High Plains Journals, Sorghum/Wheat. My name is Jennifer Latsky, and I'm the Associate Editor for High Plains Journal, and I will be your moderator for this session. You know, for 70 years, High Plains Journal has been a weekly fixture in your mailboxes. I know that's how it was at the Latsky household. Today, we have expanded from our flagship print publication and our online website, hpj.com, into more platforms to reach you. Now, many of you are signed up for our weekly HPJ direct newsletters for wheat and sorghum topics, but if you would like to receive more updates on other topics, be sure to head over to hpj.com/sign up and select the topics you'd like to learn about more each month, and those will be sent directly to your email. We also offer a free weekly podcast, HPJ Talk, featuring myself and Kayleen Scott as co-hosts, with commentary, news, featured interviews, and more. You can find us on iTunes, Google, Spotify, and you can subscribe for free notifications every week each time a new episode drops. We're also on the HPJ website, hpj.com/podcasts. Now, like all of you, we wish that we could be conducting our Sorghum/Wheat in person this year, but safety has to come first. And so we and our very gracious and flexible speakers and sponsors have pivoted to this virtual platform. This is just one more way that HPJ is showing that we are committed to you, our neighbors. Now, I'm sure many of you have had some experience with the Zoom webinar platform over the last 7 months or so, but for those of you who may be unfamiliar with how this will work, let me share some notes. So first off, we've tried to mute your video and your microphones, but if you could do so on your own, that would be really great. If you have questions, and honestly, that's why we bring the U events directly to you, we ask that you click on the chat box below and type your questions in the pop-up box that appears to the side of your screen. We've built in plenty of time to ask questions during this webinar. All of the sessions will be recorded, and the recordings will be posted after we're done soon as we can at hpj.com/SUWU. The schedule of sessions and speakers is posted there as well. And if you miss a session live, remember, you can always catch up with the recordings later at your convenience. This second session of our Sorghum Wheat is brought to you by BASF. And here's a word from them. Alrighty, well, thank you so very much, BASF, for sponsoring this session, as well as being one of our fine sponsors of the All Aboard Wheat Harvest that we bring to you each summer at High Plains Journal. For more than a decade, we've brought the story of wheat harvest to you through our custom cutter correspondence. And this year, we actually added a regular Facebook Live appearance from the field from each of our correspondents. So if you haven't already, go ahead and visit the All Aboard Harvest Facebook page and follow along. This week, our correspondent, Stephanie Croney, will be in the field with BASF's Ken Diebert, who is a local tech services rep, and Matthew Peterson, a local sales rep. And now it's time to kick off our second session of Sorghum and Wheat U with K-State's very own Romulo Lollato, Assistant Professor of Agronomy and Extension Wheat and Forages Specialist. Romulo, the screen is yours.
Hi, Jenny. Yeah, hello, everyone. It's good to be here. Good to be talking to you today. I wish this was in person, but we will adapt and do what we need to here. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And as I do so, I need to acknowledge that Jenny did challenge us here quite a bit today and asked us to keep our message to about 20 minutes or so. And if you guys already saw an extension specialist talking, that can be a challenge, right? So, but anyways, let's go ahead and get to the point here of the message today. So what I'm going to share with you today is really a compilation of what we learned last growing season, right? The 2019-2020 wheat growing season, in actually 3 different experiments that we had throughout the state. These 3 different experiments, they were actually planted in 14 locations, right? So it's quite a bit of data that we're going to share here today. The main objective of those experiments were either to understand if different varieties respond differently to nitrogen management and to fungicide management, right? So moving on here, the first experiment that we're going to talk about, I'm calling it the big nitrogen experiment. And in this one, essentially what we did is we evaluated these 14 varieties that you see there on screen, right? From Bentley, Bob Dole, all the way to some West bred varieties, Genta, Lima Grain, and K-State as well, of course. Keep in mind that for the fungicide experiment, we were looking at the very same varieties, right? So that's the list of varieties that we had there. 4 different nitrogen rates, right? We're ranging from 0, 40, 80, and 120 pounds of nitrogen applied per acre. And this particular trial, we ran it in 4 locations last season. Those were Ashland Bottoms, Conway Springs in Sumner County, Hutchinson in Reno County, and Great Bend. Now, it's interesting to notice that if we look at the amount of soil nitrate nitrogen that is listed there in the bottom too, you'll see that it ranges from about 20 pounds of nitrogen in the profile at the time of planting, all the way to 110 and 172 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So a very large range on the amount of nitrogen that was present in the soil at the time of planting, right? So whenever we add those to the amount of nitrogen that we're putting up, we really had a very nice range of nitrogen availability to test these varieties against. So here's just to give you an idea of the yield levels that we got in this experiment, right? In all these locations, we're ranging from about 20 bushels per acre all the way to close to 90 bushels per acre, averaging about 50 bushels per acre across these 4 locations and over 200 observations that we had in the experiment. And here, just to give you an idea of the type of visual response that we were seeing in these experiments, we have here one variety, for example, WB 4269, and you have these photos here in Ashland Bottoms, the variety either at 0 or nitrogen, pounds of nitrogen per acre, or 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Very large difference in the amount of biomass that these varieties is putting out, in how green these leaves are as well, just indicating some nitrogen deficiency in that 0 nitrogen treatment. If we move a little bit closer to maturity, then we start seeing these differences that you can see in the photo in early April, but now in early June, that really that extra nitrogen translated in quite a bit more heads per area, right? And we can see that very clearly from this photo here, some differences in biomass that we're measuring now, and also grain yield, of course. So that was the case for WB4269. Very similar case as well if we look, for example, for a very contrasting variety in this experiment, which was Bob Dole. And I'm going to get into the detail of why I mentioned that for this particular experiment, these varieties were quite contrasting, right? 4269 and Bob Dole. But again, the response that we see there early in the season, much more biomass, much darker green leaves. And later in the season, we see a much larger number of heads and, of course, productive peelers towards maturity. So that, of course, translating in different yield levels for these 2 different varieties. These photos were from the experiment in Ashland Bottoms. If we take a very quick look at the experiments in Conway Springs, which was there in Sumner County, another soil where we had a considerable amount of or very low nitrogen, actually. You can see here that the response was even larger in that location. We did apply sulfur in all of these plots, although this looks kind of sulfur deficient. We did apply about 20 units of sulfur to all of these plots, so that was not a confounding factor, right? And that's again 4269 there. And we're gonna go over the photos here for Bob-Dole as well, just to give you an idea again of the type of differences that we were seeing in the late part of April. So so far I showed the photos from 4269 and Bob-Dole, and why am I selecting those two varieties? And the reason is here in this chart. So let me explain what we're looking at first, and then I'm going to go into the differences, right? So essentially in red we have Bob-Dole, in yellow we have WB4269, and each one of these points is a combination of nitrogen and location. So for example, the lowest one there is the lowest nitrogen rate in the lowest yielding environment for those two varieties. And the other extreme, in the right hand side, we will have the highest nitrogen rate in the highest yield environment. And when we look in the bottom axis there, what that's showing us is really the average of all those 14 varieties, right? In this case, close to that 70 to 75 bushels per acre. And if we look on the left-hand side, we're actually going to look at the average of each one of those. Okay, so what is this telling us, and why were these varieties so different, again, when the limitation was nitrogen? And that's very important, because the next trial that the limitation was fungicide, their performance was actually quite similar. So when the limitation was nitrogen, right, these varieties performed quite differently. And so if we look here, what we see is that as the yield of all those varieties increased, the yield for 4269 actually increased 1.2 times the average of those other varieties, right? Meaning that in higher yielding environments, it was performing better than the average, right? Whereas for Bob-Dole, it was the other way around. For every unit increase in yield for all those other varieties, it only increased about 0.8, meaning that it had a better performance in lower yielding environments, right? And that can be because perhaps it's putting more nitrogen in the grain as protein. It can also be because maybe it's a little bit more prone to lodging. So if we're putting too much nitrogen out there, it might not stand as well. So this was the performance when nitrogen was limited. Now, let's take a quick look here across all of these locations and all of these varieties. How did nitrogen impact grain yield? That's what we were looking at here. All those black points, there are different varieties and different locations, right? And in the bottom, we have the amount of nitrogen available in the season, including the soil, the amount of nitrogen in the soil plus what we applied, and grain yield in the left-hand side. And essentially, this data here pretty clearly falls into two categories, right? Either a high-yielding category in blue or a lower-yielding category in yellow. So we're splitting the data in high-yielding and low-yielding in the rest of the analysis here. Okay, so let's take a quick look on how we're going to look at this data. Here again, we have those two varieties that were very contrasting, Bob-Dole and WB4269. And this is just showing the low-yielding environment. And what we can see is that there was a range where they increased in yields when nitrogen was limited, and then there was a plateau, right? There was really no effect of nitrogen rate on yield anymore. And the two things that are interesting here is if we look at the breakpoint, so how much nitrogen we needed to reach that highest yield, and how high was the yield, right? So in this case, for Bob-Dole, we needed about 100 pounds of N, and we reached the 47 bushel per acre average. For 4269, we needed about 109 units of N, reaching about 52 bushels per acre in those low yielding conditions. Let's move now for the higher yielding conditions, right? And what we see there is a little bit more contrasting. And again, looking at the breakpoint there of available nitrogen, again, right, counting with the amount that was in the soil at planting, Bob-Dole needed close to 200 units total available to reach that 64 bushel per acre. Whereas 4269, the model here is telling us that it needed a little bit more, close to 230 to reach that 84 bushel per acre. But honestly, if we take a look at those points where it truly maximized yield, they're very close, right? In other words, doesn't seem to have a lot of variability there on how much nitrogen these different varieties were needing to reach that maximum yield level. So if you're interested, here is a summary of all of those varieties, right? You can see here that what we're looking at, the plateau is the yield, the maximum yield that it reached in the high yield environment, ranging there from 64 to 84 bushels per acre, averaging 71. And this is how much available nitrogen was needed between what we applied plus what was in the soil. And then we have here for the low yield environment as well. We see here that it ranged from 42 to 52 bushels per acre, and all varieties were close to that 100 to 110 units of nitrogen per acre available to reach that yield level. So the question that we have next here is the amount of nitrogen needed to reach, do varieties that reach a higher yield level, do they also needed more nitrogen to get there? Or was it really about the same nitrogen needed to get to that higher yield level? And that's what we're showing here, right? In the bottom, so each one of those points is one different variety. In the bottom, we have the amount of nitrogen needed to reach that breakpoint. And in the left, how high that breakpoint was, right? So essentially what this is telling us is that there was really no relationship there. Varieties that were yielding more, they were not necessarily requiring more nitrogen to get there, right? So the question here becomes, if these varieties are reaching very different yield levels with about the same amount of nitrogen, why is it, right? And the two questions are, do some varieties have a higher nitrogen use efficiency, or is it simply because they just have lower protein? It has lower protein, it's going to be a cheaper product, the end product, and so might not require as much nitrogen. So we don't have the protein data in yet, but we're working on that. But we can go into that first part on the nitrogen use efficiency, right? So very briefly looking at the nitrogen use efficiency, what you're seeing at here is that the more nitrogen available that there was, the less efficient those plants were in producing yield. So that nitrogen use efficiency is simply the amount of bushels per acre produced for every unit of nitrogen available per acre. The more nitrogen out there, the less efficient those plants were. Now, what was the effect of variety within there, right? If we look at the effect of variety, there were some differences between the varieties, some of them being more efficient. That's the blue bars that you see there. So in this case, WB Grainfield and WB 4269, they were both more efficient than the three varieties in yellow, which were Everest, Green Hammer, and WB 4458. But the varieties in green, they were in between. They were the same as the blue and the same as the yellow, right? So there was a range there. There was a couple extremes in each side, but overall, they were kind of similar, keeping in mind that some of these extremes. Now, the next question that we still don't have data was, is this because these varieties in blue are producing less protein or not? And we're going to answer that hopefully later this year. But the other thing that we were interested here within this set of data was also, if we look at the range where nitrogen is limiting to grain yield, right? Which in these cases here was less than 100 units of N available in the low yielding environment, less than 200 units of N available in the high yielding environment. Varieties that were more efficient using nitrogen in those conditions where nitrogen was limited, did they also have a higher yield potential? Meaning that if they use nitrogen more efficiently here when it's limiting, and they also reach higher yield plateaus later on? And the answer to this one was yes. So there was, again, each one of these points that you're seeing here is a different variety. In blue, the high yield environment, in yellow, the low yield environment. And they were significantly related, meaning that varieties that were using nitrogen more efficiently when nitrogen was limiting, they're also able to reach a higher yield level, a higher yield plateau when nitrogen was not limiting. So folks, this wraps up the nitrogen portion of these trials that I wanted to talk to you today. Switching gears here now and moving into the fungicide response that we were seeing during this last growing season as well, right? Again, very briefly going over the layout that we're looking at here, we have the same 14 varieties that we were talking about up to now, but now instead of having 4 nitrogen management strategies, we actually have 4 fungicide managements, right? Either no fungicide at all, or 1 fungicide application at jointing, or 1 fungicide application at heading, or both, right? We went both at jointing and heading. And all of these applications was with Top Guard. And this trial we had in 5 locations, right? We had Ashland Bottoms, Conway Springs, Hutchinson, full season, Hutchinson after soybeans, and Bellevue after soybeans. And it's important to mention that these sites after soybeans, they usually have a more limited yield potential because we're planting them late. Before going live here, I actually saw that Scott Stagenborg was he was online, and he did a lot of great work on these late planted wheat after summer crops that we use until today, a lot of that information. So again, keeping in mind that some of these sites were planted late after soybeans, and so they had a different growing environment, right? They're going to go through probably grain fielding period with more heat stress to begin with. And we did disease ratings in all of these locations, right? After each one of those fungicide applications. So briefly here, taking a look at the yield levels that we're talking about. this trial had a little bit lower range in yield, so it actually went from 40 to about 80 bushels per acre, averaging a little bit higher too, averaging about 58 bushels per acre. And that's the yield levels that we were talking about. This next slide is going to be quite busy, but don't worry about it. The message on this one, what we're looking at here is just the disease ratings that we did in all of these sites. And the message here really is that in all sites, except for one, we had pretty severe septoria show up. Some of them, we also had 10 spot and early in the season. And late in the season, essentially in all the sites, we had different levels of stripe and leaf rust and also of septoria. So that gives you an idea of the type of disease environment that we were working with. Let's take a look here at a couple of photos from these trials, right? And the first one that I'll share with you is of a variety that is overall resistant to especially some stripe rust here, and with either with the dual fungicide, adjointing plus heading, or with no fungicide at all. So we have here LCS Chrome, and you can see that there's virtually or visually no difference there in the amount of green canopy cover that we have in this variety, 85% versus 78%. So very little effect of the fungicide there. But really, by the time, and these will actually affect the amount of light intercepted that the canopy is going to be able to intercept and transform that into grain filling. And if we look at a susceptible variety now, and for example, Everest, right, susceptible especially to stripe rust and some of those early season diseases as well, we can see here that the effect of the fungicide was actually much more clear, right? Without the fungicide, we only had about 66% of green canopy cover during mid-grain filling, whereas with that fungicide, and in this case, the dual fungicide, we had close to 80% canopy cover. So for this variety, which is much more susceptible, especially to stripe rust and some of those early season diseases, a very large difference there in green canopy cover during the grain filling period, which again translates into radiation interception, translates into better water use and whatnot. Okay, let's go over the overall effect of these fungicides again across all varieties and across all these 5 locations. So really a lot of data that we're looking at in these 4 bars here. What we're looking at here is the fungicide management and the grain yield. So essentially with no fungicide, the average across all of these sites were 56. We gained about 1.2 or 1.8 bushels per acre from that early fungicide alone. Right? If we look at the last fungicide alone, that fungicide that heading alone was about 3.3, 3.5 bushels per acre that we were gaining with that one. And both together was about 4.3 here. So you see that it's kind of like a stairway there, whereas the yields were progressively better as we added more fungicides, right, to the system. However, these of course depended on location. Some locations, the benefit was much larger than others. So for example, if we just look at Hutchinson, and again, across all the varieties, and this is the full season data for good yield potential here, we can see that it goes from 64 bushels per acre average all the way to 71 bushels per acre on average. Now, if we look at Bellevue, which again, it was a site that had a considerable amount of disease, but it was planted late. And so the heat stress during the grain filling period, it was a driving force, a dominant force driving grain yields. So essentially, even though we were seeing disease differences in that site, we essentially saw no response to the fungicide simply because of that heat stress later in the growing season. Likewise, there were differences among varieties, and these varieties responded differently per site. So these 2 graphs here that we're looking at are 2 different varieties, and this was echelon bottoms, where we had a considerable amount of disease pressure late in the season. So essentially in the top we have Everest, and we see that the yield gains that we're having were about 4 bushels per acre from the jointing fungicide, to 6 from the heading fungicide, all the way to about 8 from both fungicides. So really a yield gain there of up to about 15%, right? Or we're not losing 15% from not applying. Whereas in Chrome, it was a more modest, right? We're more looking at about 8% again, because being a much more tolerant variety. Now, looking at these very same 2 varieties, but in a site where there was heat stress and less disease as well. Again, there was still some benefit from the fungicide to a very susceptible variety, Again, we still had diseases on this side, but really in chrome, just the genetic tolerance was already enough to make sure that yields were at a very acceptable level there. So if we would briefly summarize the type of yield gains or lack yield gains that we're having from the fungicide application for each of the varieties here, the first column, what you have there is the average yield of that variety across all locations with the no fungicide treatment, right? Without any fungicide. Then the next three columns are just yield gains from the jointing, the heading, and both fungicide applications on those varieties. And from the jointing one, we see that on average, again, was at that 1.8 bushels per acre. But some of these varieties, Grainfield, Larry, and even Avers, right, perhaps more susceptible to some of those early season diseases, we're seeing up to 3 or 4 bushels per acre yield gain on those varieties. Likewise, on the heading fungicide, it's somewhat of a different set of varieties that were leading to a very large kind of yield gain, up to 6 or 7 bushels per acre from that heading fungicide. And finally, if we look at both fungicide applications, it was almost the same varieties there that were leading to that higher yield gain from the foliar fungicide application, right? But another thing that is interesting to look at is really the varieties that are yielding well without fungicide, and they're not gaining much, but that's probably because they have a decent disease faction, so they're not really losing much yield actually from not applying that fungicide, right? Which are those that are highlighted here in yellow. Then you see that in this case, Bob Dole shows up again. So that's why I was mentioning that it's important. When nitrogen was limitation, it didn't do as well. When fungicide was the limitation, still did fairly decent there. Just out of curiosity here, how was disease levels affecting our yield, right? And these, what we're looking at here, folks, is our disease ratings in the bottom and grain yield. And this is for that early septoria, right? Something that many times we take for granted and say, well, that's not really going to affect much our yields. And in fact, in out of those 5 locations, in one of them only, there was a significant yield loss from more disease, which is that Hutchinson, full season, good yield potential, a lot of early season septoria. We had less yield the greater the disease rating was. If we look at the late season disease ratings, right, which we're typically more concerned with, we see here for Ashland bottoms and for Hutchinson. Now we're looking at the sum of all those 3 diseases, right? We have septoria, leaf rust, and stripe rust showing up, and how they were affecting yields, right? So in Hutchinson, the full season, and in Ashland bottoms, sites that were actually pretty good yield potential, we had a very significant and severe loss of yield the more disease that we had there, kind of regardless of variety and of fungicide. Now we go to those late planted crops after soybeans, right, where they were exposed to heat stress, which what we're looking at here, Hutchinson, Conway Springs, and Belleville. Well, even though there was a pretty large range in disease, that's what you see there in our ratings, there was a pretty large range of disease, meaning that many varieties were showing much more disease than others. There was really no relationship with yield, meaning that heat stress was really what was driving the yields here, and not the amount of disease pressure, at least in these sites here. So just to finalize here, we got one of these varieties, the Grainfield one, which was a relatively susceptible variety. And we also put the same fungicide treatments on it, those 4 treatments that we had, in another 10 locations, right? So we just wanted to see, okay, what's the typical gain that we have from that fungicide in a susceptible variety? And that's what we're looking at in this graph, in this next graph here, is that same graph that you already understood how to interpret that. So in the bottom, we're actually having here the average of all those fungicide treatments. The left-hand side, how much each individual treatment average, right? In red, you see no fungicide, and you see that red is always below all the other treatments, meaning that it was consistently for a Grainfield at least yielding less than the other treatments. In yellow, we have just that jointing fungicide. We can see a little bit of an advantage in those lower yielding environments. In white, we have only the heading fungicide, and in blue, we have both jointing and heading fungicide. And what is interesting here is to look at the ratio that I was mentioning to you, which is the slope here, right? That slope of close to 1.1 with the dual fungicide application tells us that that treatment, it increasing 1.1 times the average of all the other treatments, meaning that in higher yielding environments, it might be a better treatment, right? Because it's gaining more yield for each increase in average yield in that location. Meanwhile, The heading fungicide had a similar behavior, and the jointing fungicide was the opposite, right? Meaning that it was actually a better treatment in lower yielding environments. And finally here, if we just look at the stability, because another thing that we look at is not only the adaptability of these treatments, but also how stable the yields were. The closer to one, this value of stability, the more stable the yields were in that treatment. And we see here that the no fungicide in red had a 0.88, and that progressively increased in stability, or it increased towards 1 in stability as we added more fungicides to the system here. Again, with several locations where we had a considerable amount of disease, especially in central Kansas. So wrapping up here, folks, a couple of take-home messages from this last season in regards to nitrogen and fungicide, right? Very interestingly that we found that the optimum nitrogen rate was similar across all varieties, despite those varieties being very different in yield potential, right? How far they were able to reach at that break point. So some of it was explained by nitrogen use efficiency, some varieties with more nitrogen use efficiency than others. But really, I'm very curious to know about protein, right? Are some of these varieties very high yielding, perhaps very low protein? And that kind of brings us back to the discussion that Eric was mentioning this morning there with getting paid for in the farmer panel in managing for quality as well, right? Variety selection being very important for that aspect. And from the fungicide aspect of these studies here, that the effect of that fungicide, of course, depended on site year, on the disease level, on that site year, and with variety as well, and also on the level of heat stress that we had later in the growing season. Sometimes we were seeing diseases, but we're not really seeing the response to the fungicide, mostly because of that heat stress. And the single and the dual fungicide application, especially the single one focused ahead, they were treatments that were more geared towards high yield environments. So they improved yields more in higher yield environments compared to lower yield environments. So folks, that's my attempt to get everything done in 20 minutes there. If you have any questions, you're more than welcome to throw them in the chat, and we can talk about them now. Otherwise, you also have my contact information there, my email, Twitter, and Facebook. So make sure that you follow me there, and I'll be happy to share any of this data and continue the conversation through those venues as well. Big shout out here, Jenny, for the Wheat Commission for helping sponsor a lot of this research that is going on with wheat production in Kansas, really trying to bring a very applied information to the grower so you can actually better manage the wheat in your own farm.
Well, great. Hey, thank you so very much, Romulo. I always learn so much about wheat whenever you speak, and I appreciate that. Now, folks, remember, if you've got questions, just click on the button at the bottom of the screen, and you can go ahead and type them in the box that pops up, okay? And you can submit your questions at any time, even during the presentations, and we'll get to those to as many of those as we can. While we wait for some questions, I do have a couple here. Talking about the environment, and you did a lot of research, Romulo, into that ideal environment and what can we do to give our wheat a leg up, and using fungicide applications and applying that nitrogen correctly are two of the things. What are some other things that you and others in the field are a little bit concerned about going into planting this fall? How can we give ourselves the best bet possible to have a good harvest in 2021?
That's an excellent question, Jenny, and I'm glad that you brought it up, because I think what we need to be very concerned with, especially this year, is controlling volunteer wheat, right? The wheat that we didn't harvest and that stayed in the field, whether because hailstorm or just because the combine was leaving some behind, that's going to become volunteer wheat, and that can actually cause a very serious yield losses in the following year through viral diseases like the wheat streak mosaic, for example, or barley yellow dwarf. But specifically concerned with wheat streak mosaic as we head to Western Kansas, especially in a wet summer, kind of like we have been having, where we might have several flushes of that volunteer emerging throughout the summer. Right, so one single herbicide shot might not do it. We might need to go there a couple times. But again, remember that the wheat streak mosaic is going to be a very harsh disease that can bring a lot of yield loss, not only to your own fields, but to the neighbors as well. So really controlling the volunteer will be my step number one. Then a few things that we need to be thinking of course, variety selection, right? That's huge. There are many options out there, and we cannot go over all of them now, but making sure that you know varieties that are performing well in your region and that have agronomic and disease traits of interest for your problem, right? If you're willing to spray a fungicide, well, the disease rating of that variety for fungal diseases might not be as important. If you are in Western Kansas and you're concerned with your neighbor, perhaps it doesn't control volunteer, well, there are some varieties that can offer some level of protection. They're not bulletproof, but they can offer some level of protection, either against the wheat curl mite or against the actual wheat streak mosaic virus itself. Right? So make sure that you know those and make an important and make it this very important decision. Make it being very well informed. And very briefly, another thing here is planting date. Right? Sometimes we don't talk about planting date as much in wheat as we do in corn or soybeans, right? Because, well, it's going to go through winter anyways, and then you might still feel it in the spring. Well, we did a very big survey of about 700 commercial fields of wheat in the last 3 growing seasons, and we saw that there is a very harsh yield penalty if you're not in that optimum for the region, right? That optimum being about that September 25th time frame for Western Kansas, and more like October 10th in North Central Kansas, perhaps October 15th in South Central Kansas. If you're not on that optimum, you're losing yield potential every day that we're going behind. So just try to be at that optimum. Again, remember, if you're planting the wheat late, it's going to emerge late and it's going to go through grain filling later, probably getting exposed to heat stress and all of these other concerns that we briefly touched on today.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience. Is a head-only fungicide application the most yield bang for your buck? The questioner asks, I feel like I'm consistently telling farmers to spray something on wheat and always wonder, do several applications of fungicide, herbicide, fertilizer, do they pay in the end?
Yeah, that's a very good question there, and definitely the heading one would be the biggest bang for your buck, and that's kind of what the objective of this research that we're doing is okay. Well, what's the value of that first one? How does it first one that I mean adjoining? Should we really be looking at that? And how does that compare with the heading one and with both? And based on what we saw this last season, which remember was a season that we saw kind of unprecedented levels of 10 spot and septoria early on. So if there's any season that we would see a response to that early one, it would have been this season compared to historically in Kansas, right? And we saw that 1.8 bushels per acre out of 56. I mean, does that really pay? Well, if you need to focus on one, I'll definitely then focus on that heading one, right? I'll definitely focus on that one. And again, make sure that you know your variety susceptibility, right? Because in some varieties that were showing some pretty good yield potential and not much yield loss from not applying the fungicide, you might even get by with one. But so again, it really depends on the variety and on the environment that we are working with.
And I'd also imagine it also, if you've got a market that you're trying to get, as far as say you're trying to sell for a protein market or something along those lines, right? A target.
So that would come more down. They'll come down more towards the nutrient fertility management, right? And we have quite a bit of work both with nitrogen and with sulfur as well. Didn't have time to share the sulfur data here, but it is a growing concern that we have in Kansas, seeing more and more sulfur deficiency in commercial fields. And so, the Wheat Commission is funding a very large 3-year project on sulfur research, and we're seeing pretty interesting results there. So, again, it comes down more to the base fertility that we have. If we're looking at that milling, well, the baking characteristics would come more down to the fertility. The milling one, remember that a larger kernel might actually be better for milling, right? So the milling one might be related to the fungicide too, right? Because we see an increase in 1,000 kernel weight when we are applying fungicide at heading many times. And so from, again, the loaf of volume and whatnot, the baking perspective, fertility related, more nitrogen and sulfur. If we're more looking at the milling, right, we need the larger kernel, the fungicide plays an important role there too.
Okay. Remember, folks, go ahead and submit your questions here. Got another one. We talked this morning with our farmer panel, and Eric had mentioned that he's really excited about some of the research that's coming through the pipeline, especially coming out of our Wheat Innovation Center there at K-State in Manhattan. We are a preeminent spot around the world to bring answers to a lot of wheat farmers' questions. What are some other research? You mentioned the sulfur trials, but what are some other things that are in the pipeline that can excite farmers? Other projects that you and your colleagues are working on.
Yeah, so from my perspective there, as I mentioned, it's very applied, right? All the projects that we have, they are very applied, and again, with the goal of answering what should we be doing differently on the farm, so we can actually improve our yield and our profit, of course. Now, the Kansas Wheat Commission is funding a lot of other research that perhaps they're not as applied as the one that I run in my own program, right? But they're very exciting as well. So, for example, every year they invest on the wheat breeding program, right? A considerable amount of money there, and not only to bring improve hard red winter wheat or hard white winter wheat varieties to growers, but the wheat program at K-State is also working on developing a Durham wheat breeding program, right? So more focus on Northwest Kansas, perhaps trying to get a little bit different market there, right? And so that's quite exciting too. Perhaps here in a few years we might have some very well adapted varieties that gives growers these other options, right? There's some more molecular work going on as well, trying to find some the wheat genome, for example, that provide yield components of interest. So okay, well, found this marker that is related to higher kernel weight. Can we actually get these now, put in our adapted varieties, and what we found in the lab, does that translate in the field or not? Right. So there's a lot of exciting things like that the Kansas State University, together with the Kansas Wheat Innovation Center and with support from the growers, right? Because remember, about 2 cents from each bushel goes back into the Wheat Innovation Center. That translates into this applied research and basic research as well, that in the end, we want to bring to growers' fields. So.
Great. So we talked about coming into planting this fall. We talked about nitrogen management, sulfur management, or nitrogen management. Sorry.
Sulfur and fungicide. Yep.
Fungicide. Sorry. I switch fungicide and fertilizer in my head a little bit. And we talked about knowing your disease and your fungicide response that's built into the variety that you're planting. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that people understand about going into planting this fall, or selecting their seeds if they haven't already selected their varieties, or anything else, some final thoughts that you can think of?
Well, I always like to recommend the growers, whenever they're making a decision, they make the most informed decision that they can, right? And that's why we're trying to develop all of this information for growers, right? That's why we're trying to.
Yeah, so that's the final message there, Jenny. Just make an informed decision. We have plenty of material, plenty of information in K-State website and other resources as well. So make sure that reach out to county agents and to others in the region as well, so you can make the most informed decision possible. Thinking how you're planning to manage your wheat in the entire growing season, that's going to affect your variety selection. That's going to affect all the management steps that you're going to take to ensure that higher yield level, higher profitability.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you so much, Romulo, for your flexibility and joining us here today on our virtual wheat and sorghum U. And remember, folks, if you have questions for Romulo or any of our other speakers, go ahead and send those in to us and we'll pass them along. And of course, Romulo is on Facebook and Twitter. And so the Twitter handle again?
It's KSU Wheat, both on Facebook and on Twitter. It's KSU Wheat.
There you go. And he's really responsive to answering good questions. So thanks again, Romulo. We appreciate it. And while we get our next speaker lined up, we want to take a brief moment to recognize some of our sponsors for today's session.
Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. Headlights on both ends of my day. This country life is for me. Ride with us, HPJ. Ride with us, HPJ.
Kaufman Seeds is your full-service seed company, offering one of the most complete seed wheat lineups in the state, including varieties from Kansas Wheat Alliance, Oklahoma Genetics, Lima Grains Cereal Seeds, and Syngenta's AgroPro.
If you're looking for the yield leaders, check our lineup. We are sure to have varieties to fit your fields. Treatment with fungicides and insecticides are available. We have many dealers throughout southern Kansas and into Oklahoma selling bulk, totes, and bagged. So call Kaufman Seeds today for the dealer in your area.
Thanks to all of our sponsors for our virtual Sorghum and Wheat U. Sponsors like the following help us bring opportunities like this to you. Protect the Harvest, Ward Labs, AGI SureTrack, Alta Seed, Kaufman Seed, and more. We appreciate these sponsors, and we want to draw your attention to the digital program that was emailed to registrants with information about them. Well, now it's time to bring on our next guest speaker, Dr. Ruhiyyih Dyrdahl-Young, Regional Technical Field Representative for BASF. Dr. Ruhiyyih is a BASF Seed Treatment Technical Field Representative for the Northern Great Plains. She serves as a technical touch point for BASF's sales force. In addition to serving the sales force and the seed treatment regional account managers, she also has research and development responsibilities. She works on BASF innovations from early research compounds to life cycle management for BASF seed treatment products. Ruhiyyih, take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all digitally, although I have to say that I'm really looking forward to when it's safe for all of us to be together in the same place. I thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation from the High Plains Journal. As Jenny said, my first name is Ruhiyyih, which is actually an Arabic name. I always enjoy thinking about sort of my mother's side of the family is from Iran. And if you think about that part of the world, that was actually the place where wheat was first domesticated. So I feel like it's a crop very near and dear to my heart. I live in Minnesota, and I mostly serve growers across the northern Great Plains. But I want to talk today about an insect, wireworms, and their biology, as well as share a little bit of the innovation that BASF is bringing to help give you guys a new tool to work with this really difficult insect. So I'm going to take over here, and I'm going to share some slides with you. All right. So yeah, I am a regional technical field representative and wanted to talk today about wireworms, talk a little bit about the problem that they pose in wheat production. And I put my Twitter handle up there. I really love keeping in touch that way on Twitter, and I'll post a lot of things throughout the week, especially hashtag Wireworm Wednesdays. So if you're ever interested in interesting wireworm facts, you know, it's a good source there for you. Wireworms. I really like to start out sometimes by kind of talking about this quote. So this is from one of our cereal entomologists up actually in Canada, sort of just north of my territory. But sort of I think the whole point of showing you this is I feel like it really highlights sort of the root of this problem we're all facing. So she says, Dr. Canton, I started my career here 2.5 years ago, and I asked farmers what are the most important things for me to study, and wireworms kept coming up. And the reason is that it's complicated and there are not many answers. Wireworms are a major problem because There aren't a lot of chemical controls available. You can use neonicotinoid seed treatments, but it doesn't kill wireworms. They only sort of put them to sleep. So when we survey growers, wheat growers, throughout the whole country, when we ask about what are the insect pests that they're facing, overwhelmingly, it's wireworms. So this is a very complicated insect, which makes controlling it very difficult. As we've mentioned, our current class of insecticides are seed-applied neonicotinoids. So this includes our trade name Cruiser and Gaucho and Nipsit or thimethoxam, imidacloprid, clothianidin. And the difference between what these insecticides do in a wireworm context is they just briefly repel wireworms. And they can help give you a little bit of protection while your stand is getting established. But ultimately, we lost some really effective chemical controls in 2007 on wheat in Lindane. And since then, this wireworm problem has really become a lot more of an issue for a lot more growers. There are some other, controls for wireworms that are in other crops. So when I talk to growers in the Pacific Northwest, oftentimes they talk about controlling wireworms in their wheat crop by rotating to potatoes, where of course we have Regent, which is a very good wireworm insecticide. So when we're thinking about wheat protection across the country, there really is a need for an insecticide that's going to be active on wireworms. And so kind of setting up this problem further, if we think about the areas where wheat are grown, what you're looking at is a heat map of wheat production areas across the United States. And in a lot of cases, it's important to sort of get that big picture, because I spend a lot of time in the more northern geographies than Kansas. But even in Kansas, if you're, sort of in preparing for this talk, I was reading a lot more about what Kansas entomologists are posting, and then what's happening across the Southern Great Plains. And I was seeing a lot of reports of wireworms here. So I definitely don't think it's only a Northern Great Plains issue. Seeing more reports across the Southern Great Plains as well. And, again, anytime in our rotation when we're having a tight cereals on cereals rotation, or cereals rotating to corn, or if we're seeing, if we're in a situation where we're adding canola in, or dry beans or soybeans, the problem with this insect is that they're very opportunistic in their feeding. So again, you can get that kind of pressure building up from just based on what the crop rotation is. So I'm throwing a lot at you, sort of facts here, but I did want to spend a little bit of time delving into what are we really talking about when we're talking about wireworms, and why is this such an important pest for us to scout for, to understand our pressure, and then also to have some good management techniques for. So this is a very complicated diagram that I've thrown up at you, but I'm going to try to walk through it and break it down a little bit. So wireworms are the larval stage of the adult click beetle. So in a typical insect, when we think about it, oftentimes the life cycle will be just throughout one season. But what makes wireworms unique and really complicated is that larval stage can last from anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on what species you have in the field. And you can have multiple species in the same field. So you get that 3 to 5 year resident population. So that population is going to be there in the soil. So the wireworms you have there in the field today are somewhere in that 3 to 5 year life cycle. So in the springtime, when we plant the wheat crop, or if we're planting a winter wheat crop, relevant in sort of both circumstances, when the soil temperatures come up, and the wheat seed starts to germinate, it's actually putting off, the germinating wheat seed is putting off carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide actually calls the wireworms up through the soil. And they'll come up and they will feed on that germinating seedling. or on that plant as it's getting established. Earlier on in the season, you'll see the adults have overwintered under the soil. So they'll come up and they'll fly and they'll mate and they'll lay more eggs. So basically you have a couple different forms of pressure and a couple different sources of wireworms in a given season. So you have the resident population that's going to come up. You also have those new ones that are going to hatch out in one season. And those are going to be your new source of pressure. Then after the wireworm feeds a couple times and goes through its life cycle, then it's going to pupate and you're going to have more adults. So again, it's complicated, it's messy, you have multiple generations active in the same field, and that 3 to 5 year life cycle, and the fact that they feed on so many different crops means that you really can have populations build up pretty rapidly. So we did a little bit of modeling based on the research to kind of think about how could these populations build up in the field. So we know that about 20% of the larval resident population will graduate to adulthood every single season. So you'll lose potentially 20% of that resident population. But those adults are going to be laying approximately 50 eggs. The females approximately 50 eggs. So if you start out year one with a relatively low, let's just say across an acre, you have relatively low population of just 10 wireworms on that acre. So those 2 adults present are going to lay 100 eggs. And then if you continue with that 20% and the 50 eggs throughout 3 years and 3 seasons, then what you end up with is what started out as a very low population can build up to a pretty high population in a very short period of time. So why do wireworms matter so much in wheat? We talked about it's a complicated life cycle. We talked about the fact that those populations can really build up really quickly. We talked about the fact that they feed on a lot of different crops that are in typical rotations. So I met a grower in southern Idaho, Dan Lakey, and I saw him on Twitter, and he was having really horrific wireworm problems. So I reached out to him and I wanted to go see his farm. So I was traveling in that area and took a ride out. He was very gracious and welcomed me onto the farm and looking at it. And he allowed me to sort of use this quote that I think really kind of captures things. So when they took Lendane off the market and didn't offer a replacement for us, it stacked the deck against wheat farmers. Neonics just kind of kicked the can down the road. So again, alluding to that fact that our current class of insecticides only briefly repel wireworms and don't stop those field populations from building up and up and up, like we looked at in the last slide. Dr. Bob Vernon up in Canada is the undisputed expert on wireworms, and he's talking about how we can just build up millions of wireworms on a single acre with that sort of explosion of populations. And then also that, and this is another quote from another professor who works closely with wireworms in Idaho, and just sort of calling to the fact that we really have a real problem here with this very complicated insect and don't have a ton of control methods. So why am I here today? I work for BASF, and when I started working with wireworms, I was a graduate student at University of Florida, and they were a big problem for sweet potato production there. And so I started studying them, we started looking at them, and then when I joined BASF, I'm really grateful to have the opportunity now to work with this brand new insecticide that we are launching for the spring 2021 crop. It's very unique because it actually kills wireworms. So several times in this presentation brought up the fact that our current class of insecticides, neonicotinoids, only briefly repel. And we talked about this life cycle and how complicated it is. Let's take just a minute and look at this. On the left-hand side of this slide, you can see neonicotinoid treated seeds. So when the wheat crop gets planted, when the soil temperatures rise, when the wheat starts to germinate and putting off that CO2, calling those wireworms up out of the soil, then the neonicotinoid will be there and will briefly, as soon as the insects come, the larva wireworms come into contact with that neonic, they're just sort of briefly, almost like an intoxication for them. But they actually recover from that and they feed on the crop throughout the season. And then also when those adults come up and they fly and they lay their 50 eggs, then those hatch out. And oftentimes the insecticide will have moved up in the plant because neonics are mobile and they're systemic. So they'll leave the root zone and go up to the foliar parts of the plant, leaving the rest of that root there vulnerable and ready for wireworms to feed. So again, you can sort of see those neonics sort of in a wireworm context, not giving us very good control. So Taraxa is a brand new mode of action, and it's actually highly lethal to wireworms. A very low concentration gives really quick mortality to wireworms. So when the wireworms come up in the springtime, then when the resident population comes up, as soon as it comes into contact with the insecticide that's applied to the seed, then they are instantly killed. So you're really knocking back that resident population, allowing not only to get your crop established, but also having a huge effect on the health of the crop throughout the season and helping you to achieve those max yields, because those wireworms aren't coming on and feeding on those growing roots throughout the rest of the season. So Taraxa, I mentioned, it's a brand new mode of action when we are actually going through the process of registering this insecticide. It's so unique that it got its own brand new classification. So it's a group 30. It's very fast acting. I'm going to show you a video in just a minute to sort of give you an idea of how this looks. Really high mortality rates in a field context with just one use. After a single season with this seed applied insecticide, we're seeing between 70 and 80% reduction in that field population, that resident population in the field. It's going to have activity on both that resident population that's there for that 3 to 5 years, as well as any of those new wireworms that will hatch out mid-season, or they're called neonates. It's going to give us a good yield advantage for a seed treatment. And also it's being marketed as a solo insecticide that's going to be marketed as Taraxa, and also paired with our broad spectrum fungicide package called Stamina F4. So Stamina F4 has been on the market for a while. It's a really strong performer on the Southern Great Plains and gives us a really good broad spectrum fungal protection. So it'll be Taraxa F4, which is the insecticide with the fungicide, sort of an all-in-one seed treatment to protect your wheat field. So I'm going to advance the slide and show you guys a video that hopefully will start.
Wireworms reduce plant populations by feeding on seeds and small roots. BASF set up side-by-side experiments to highlight the effects of Taraxa on wireworms. In these experiments, 5 wheat seeds were planted in 3 separate glass containers. The containers held untreated, Taraxa-treated, and market-standard treated seeds, respectively. Then, 5 wireworms were introduced to each container. The results are clear. Only 31 hours into the experiment, there is no wireworm activity near the seeds in the Taraxa experiment. Meanwhile, the wireworms are feeding on the untreated seeds and continue returning to feed on the newly germinated roots of the market standard experiment. Taraxa provides true wireworm control, ensuring uninterrupted root growth. The result is a better plant stand and crop growth. Its unique mode of action safeguards our most important crops. Taraxa insecticide seed treatment, powerful protection that lasts. BASF, we create chemistry.
So I think, I'll just point out as well that the market standard in that experiment was a neonicotinoid insecticide, because that's what's currently on the market here. So what you're looking at right now is a study that was conducted in Washington State. And this is an area where they have some, I would say, heavy wireworm pressure. So the results are really, really dramatic. And oftentimes, one of the stories from this grower in particular who's hosted this trial in his field, he kept sending in samples of wheat seedlings. And he said, listen, I don't know what's going on. And he wanted them tested for fungus. And he was looking for, what was the germination rate on the seed. And he was trying to understand just why he couldn't get the crop established on this ground. And then later on, as the season's progressing, he was noticing that he thought he had just a total herbicide failure because he was just having horrific problems with weeds. And what was happening was those wireworms were all feeding below the ground. So it wasn't immediately apparent what was going on. But the wireworms were coming in, they were feeding on those wheat seedlings. And so on the far left-hand side of the screen, you can see that the untreated with only a base fungicide and no insecticide on it, there was really very poor stand established. And later on, that whole area where there was no wheat, the crop is going to be our best competition for weeds. So the secondary issue with wireworm infestation and getting poor stand establishment is always going to be increased weed pressure. So in the middle, you have a Taraxa-treated plot, and you can see, we got great stand establishment. The wheat is off to really strong yields moving on in the season. And then you can see with the market standard with neonicotinoid, yes, it looks much better than the untreated. And that's because those wireworms did come up, they did get briefly intoxicated, and they didn't actually eat the seed. So there was actual, a stand could get established, but you can see there was still damage. And then as this crop grows on, you can see throughout the season, there's going to be dead and dying off flag leaves as the wireworms are feeding on the roots throughout the season. So another picture we have here with, on the left-hand side, you have a neonicotinoid, so you can see a lot more weeds in the sand, and you can start to see some of that yellowing from wireworms damaging the crop and having those flag leaves die back. And then you can see really good stand establishment off to some, really nice yields here with a Taraxa treated. So, in the spirit of COVID, we all wanted to be able to do digital plot days to be able to show people what it would look like to walk through a plot. So I wanted to just show you briefly, this was another video, and this is taken of a plot in Fromberg, Montana, which is southwest of Billings. And the grower here was doing some triticale production under a pivot, and just very similar story to our grower out in Washington State that really having a hard time getting a stand established here. So this will be kind of my last showing you of Taraxas, just to get the opportunity to sort of feel like you're walking a plot, which, missing our plot days for this season. All right, that does it for me today. I'd be really happy to take any questions if there are any. Love to keep in touch on Twitter. And tomorrow's #Wireworm Wednesday, so be tweeting out, some pictures and some wireworm biology stuff, and so thank you so much for your attention. Jenny, I will relinquish control here and stop sharing.
Okay. Hey, thanks for that presentation, Ruhiyyih. And I love the hashtag Wireworm Wednesday. I think I'm going to have to start following that one. I follow quite a few odd hashtags out there anymore just because I'm an ag journalist and I think that's in my job description now. Well, folks, we're going to take a look at some of the questions that you've submitted. Remember, click the bottom chat button at the bottom of the screen. It's the cute little icon that looks like a chat bubble, and a side screen will pop up and you can just type your question in there. Meanwhile, while we wait for those questions, Ruhiyyih, I do have some. Is there a treatment threshold for wireworms? Is there a threshold that farmers should really be looking at to get ahead of the problem or to catch up to the problem?
That's such a great question. And I realize now that I did not include anything about scouting. So let me take a step back to talk about how you would know if you had wireworms in your field, right? So we talked first off, poor stand establishment, you're just can't really get things up. And then also having really weedy stand is another symptom. So what you want to do is, again, when the temperatures are up, especially if you get some good moisture in the soil, you want to scout for wireworms. And we can do this using bait traps. So they're attracted to a CO2 coming off of a germinating seedling. So what we can do is we can take either seed corn or a mix of wheat and seed corn or just wheat seed. And the easiest way to do it, honestly, is to go buy woman's pantyhose and take the end and snip it off, and you'll have a nice little tube for you, and you can just put your mixture inside, tie it off, and then you're going to soak that overnight, and that's going to start those seeds germinating, right? And then that you're going to put in your field. Dig a hole, put a flag on top, bury it, right? And give it a good 10 to 14 days. And then you're going to go back up, you retrieve your pantyhose, and you're going to cut it apart and look for wireworms inside. Now, here's an important disclaimer. That is not a foolproof method. And just because you don't see any wireworms doesn't mean they're not there, because it's a kind of a complicated thing about where are they in the soil, how deep are they in the soil. They need that moisture to be able to move through. So it's very likely you could get a false negative. You see them, if you've seen them in the field, it's good for you to assume that you've just got them, okay? So if you see, because this is not a very clean method, there's not a lot of extension articles I've seen where they're actually putting a good hard and fast recommendation of if you see X number, then you need to act. I think you got to really be very proactive in, setting your bait traps. And even if you find 1 or 2 wireworms, then I would really assume that if early season you've got that many, that you need to go ahead and start making a plan for managing your wireworms.
Okay. And we talked a little bit about how wireworms will feed not just on wheat but other crops. So I assume if a farmer is diversified and wheat and sorghum and corn and cotton and a few other things, they should be monitoring the situation. Is there a nice or a way to have a rotation that kind of breaks that cycle? Is there something that they won't feed on?
So they will feed on a lot of different crops. Like you'd be really surprised. They're considered a secondary insect for corn. They're on canola. They love wheat. They'll eat sorghum. They'll eat trit. So it really is, if you're in one of those rotations where you have those crops, then you really are going to need to manage that population. And the thing is that when we think about like a population that's 5 to 7 years, then you could have conceivably still have, if you started that rotation, you had a couple seasons of a non-host crop, which is going to be kind of difficult to find. A non-host crop, then you would still have wireworms there during that. So it's just one of those things that we really have to stay on top of it. And you know, I'm very pleased that we're actually bringing a solution to the market, because neonicotinoids are only briefly masking the problem. They're not really giving us any kind of control of our resident populations. So, you know, considering that Taraxa, when it does come to the market, is, for me, I'm thinking this is going to be a real game changer for wireworm management.
So one more question, and you know, it has to be asked: is there any effect? Because we talk a lot about you know, secondary side effects to anything that is put on our crops. So are there some beneficials that might be harmed by Taraxa or some of our other wireworm controls? Everybody talks about monarch butterflies and our pollinators. So is this an opportunity to help us manage a situation and not make another situation worse?
I love that you asked that question, because it is something that I actually think about all the time. I have a 3-year-old son, and we just bought a new place and put a bunch of milkweed in, and Joe Pye, which apparently they like. And we've been watching our monarch butterflies coming up through the season. So with seed treatments, it is one of the best options that we have, because it's going to be below ground, and you're going to be able to sort of minimize that risk that we have. Taraxa also is not systemic, so it's not going to move up into the plant into any above ground pieces of the plant. It's going to stay right there in the roots where we need it for wireworms. So as far as like seed applied insecticides, this is a really excellent option, because you are keeping the AI below the ground.
Great. And I planted milkweed in my little urban garden, and my farmer's daughter's heart just went, but I had monarch butterflies last year, so I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Well, folks, if you've got any more questions for Ruhiyyih, you can go ahead and send those in to us, or you can catch her on Wireworm Wednesdays on Twitter. And thank you again for Ruhiyyih for coming and joining us and sharing your message today. We really appreciate it. And while we get our next speaker, Jourdan Bell, lined up, we want to take a brief moment to recognize some more of our sponsors for today's session.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Ruhiyyih. Well, and thank you to all of our sponsors for our virtual sorghum and wheat U. Just a reminder, sponsors like the following help us bring opportunities like sorghum and wheat U to you. Kansas Wheat, Heartland Soil Services, Kansas Grain Sorghum Commission, BASF, and S&W Seed, as well as Shield Ag and American Ag Credit. We appreciate all of our sponsors, and we want to draw your attention to the digital program that was emailed to you with information about each of them. So joining us now is Jourdan Bell, a very familiar face to many of us in the wheat industry in the High Plains. Jourdan is an assistant professor and extension specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and among her many crop specialties is wheat and wheat production. And as many of you understand, we talked about the roots with Ruhiyyih. We talked about the top part of the wheat plant with Romulo. Today, Jourdan is going to talk about a different market opportunity for wheat crop. And it's kind of exciting because we know wheat as a great food product, as a great feed product. But here's an opportunity that might bring us some, open up some markets for us, especially out here in the High Plains. So Jourdan, the screen is yours, ma'am.
Great, thank you so much. Let me get this screen shared very quickly and we will get going. Okay, so as you mentioned, of course, as we look at the opportunity for wheat as a forage crop, everybody knows is a great dual purpose crop, but especially in the Southern Great Plains, because of the increasing demand from the regional dairies, we're really looking at an increasing demand in wheat as a silage crop. Of course, all the winter small grains really do become a great silage option. And Mark Marsalis over at New Mexico State has used the term filling the gap. And that really does fit well with our winter small grain silages. Because of the demand, our summer annuals, corn and forage sorghum, often are not fitting the need. And so our small grains are able to come in, and wheatlage really becomes a very good option for these Southern Great Plains producers. So of course, as we look at wheatlage, as I mentioned, we're filling that silage gap. However, with wheatlage, we are looking at a lower yielding silage, but higher quality. So that really can become a win-win, especially in the dairy industry. And of course, with our forages, especially at low commodity prices, they can provide farmers a very profitable option to grain crops. And another win, especially in the Southern Great Plains, as we are considering lower irrigation capacities because of the status of our aquifer, forages will use less water than the grain crop because of that earlier harvest stage. So if we are operating on a limited well capacity, this really can provide farmers some flexibility. Of course, just looking at some average silage yields from the Southern Great Plains, we see that for corn silage on a dry matter basis, usually we're looking at a tonnage of about 9.5 tons per acre, sorghum silage 8, and then wheatlage about 5.3. Of course, there's going to be a range in yields for all three of these, but those are just some average tons that producers in this region can expect under normal conditions. So as I mentioned, water use is really a big consideration for our silage crops. And as we look at normal water use for a wheat crop, we're looking at about 24 inches per year. Of course, if we're looking at irrigating for 100% ET and these greater than 100 bushel yield goals, we can exceed that. But in a normal year, our irrigation plus precipitation plus soil moisture may reach 24 inches. And so as I mentioned, when we are harvesting at an earlier stage, we can potentially minimize that water use, especially if we're harvesting maybe a boot for a green chop, or even at that soft dough stage, we're usually going to be looking at a cumulative water use significantly less than 20 inches. And so, of course, when we look at those irrigation demands for our grain crops, we're looking at about 11 inches of water. And so considering forage as an option, we can usually reduce our irrigation demand by anywhere from 4 to 6 inches of water if we have sufficient soil moisture and normal in-season precipitation. So looking at wheat for silage, of course, there's several different scenarios. We often go into a season planning for a green crop, but things happen. And this year, for example, we had freeze damage grain, and especially southwest of Amarillo with the freezes in April, many producers did opt to take their wheat to forage, primarily for silage. And so that's an option. Also, drought-stressed grain crops often are chopped for silage or hay. And then we have wheat that is intended for silage. But all in all, yield and quality will vary by year, by field, and stage. So as I talk about wheat for silage, I do want to just keep in mind that I am looking at average conditions as a whole, because yield and quality do vary, as well as dry matter. And as we start talking about silage, dry matter is something that is very important, especially because if we are not feeding as green chop, which is the silage that's chopped and directly fed or wilted in the field, that dry matter is going to affect how that silage is packed. Our small grains have a hollow stem, and so they do not pack in the silage pits as well as a corn silage or a forage sorghum silage, and air will get trapped in those silage pits much more easily. And so we do want to make sure that if we are harvesting late, or for example, this year at soft dough, we actually had dry matter that was higher than it should have been. We want to make sure that the moisture levels are correct so that we don't have air trapped, we don't run into fermentation issues that result in spoilage within those silage pits. As we look at the drive over silage piles that we primarily have on the southern high plains, our moisture should be 60 to 70%. So that's a dry matter of 30 to 40%. So on average, we need a moisture content of about 65%. As I previously mentioned, if we do harvest earlier at boot, those fields will require wilting. So as we move into soft dough, we are looking at a lower quality but higher tonnage and ideal packing moisture. And as we're considering wheat for silage, it is important to step back and are we looking at this as the farmer, the feeder, or both? Because really our harvest can depend on what that end user is desiring. Is the end user needing a higher quality feed? You know, if we're looking at for a beef cattle feedlot versus a dairy, you know, that quality is not necessarily there. You know, we're really looking at the forage for the effective fiber component. And then of course, if that higher quality is needed and they are wanting boot, like many of the dairies do want, what about the cost of wilting? As we go in, we're looking at extra equipment cost. We're looking at reduced tonnage. And as a farmer, are you going to be compensated for those reductions in tonnage and increased equipment costs? So, of course, as I previously mentioned, forage moisture at ensiling is very important. We have those hollow stems, but fiber, energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus are optimum at boot to early head. So, you know, the quality of that forage is going to be ideal and very premium quality. As I've a lot of this I've already said. So again, the wilt, the dry matter, and ideally, though, if we're looking at optimizing tonnage and return to the farmer, the harvest at early dough is really going to be critical. So I'm going to just quickly transition just from just some of the production rule of thumb guidelines into the past 2 years data set that we have from our Texas Panhandle wheatlage trials that have been in Dallam County at 3B Farms. And this is a trial that has been northwest of Dalhart. So we look at the northwestern Texas Panhandle that, you know, kind of fits into the Texas High Plains, the southwestern Kansas production region, Oklahoma Panhandle, and really does fit into this wheat production silage region very nicely. And of course, looking at these pictures, you can see, as we all know, it's just an extreme 2 years. 2019, we had very good in-season precipitation. We had very cool conditions through anthesis and into early summer in Greenville, and just had phenomenal yields. 2020 rolls around, we had a winter drought, we have above average temperatures that drive development, we have late freezes that come after above average spring temperatures, and so really just a stark difference between our two production years. So as I mentioned, you know, we are considering both boot and soft dough harvest. As we look at the production for boot, and I don't know what happened to my y-axis here, but nevertheless, as we're looking at the production, of course, we did harvest these trials at both boot and at soft dough, so that we could look at the variety response to harvest timing and really see how we could potentially help regional producers as they negotiate those contracts. So as we compare the boot and the early soft dough yields, we have, of course, a distinct difference in 2019. As we look at that boot yield, there's really no significant difference between those varieties. We're looking at a tonnage on a dry matter basis of about 3 to 3.5 tons per acre. However, as we move into early soft dough, that's really where we start to see the varieties start to separate, and we start to see a difference in those varieties and see how we respond at that early soft dough stage. But as we talk about wheatlage, it's not just the tonnage, but it is also the moisture that is important. And so as we look at the harvest moisture, as I mentioned, at boot, we're often going to have to either go in and feed as green chop and directly feed from the field, or we're going to have to wilt. So in 2019, because of those cool conditions, that forage just was not drying down. And at Boot, we were looking at a moisture of about 80%. However, as we move into soft dough, we finally start to see that moisture drop a little bit. However, we're still really a little higher than we should be, just for ideal packing. But you know, they probably could get by with it. We probably have a little more leachate than we would want. We definitely would not want to direct pack something that's at 80% moisture though. And of course, quality. That is one of those really big considerations as we start looking at negotiating these wheatlage prices. So we can see right here, just looking at crude protein, which is something that is definitely one of those feed value characteristics that is desired. At Booth, we are looking at crude protein levels that are around 15 to 16%. However, as we transition into soft dough, we rapidly see those crude protein levels drop, and now we're closer to 8 to 9% for all those varieties. So as I mentioned, you know, as we look at comparing the crude protein, the feed value, of course, digestibility is a very big component with this. And as we look and compare the feed value of our wheat to alfalfa guidelines, we can see that our wheat silage harvested at Boot actually does compare very nicely to alfalfa that would be considered a fair quality alfalfa according to the USDA Ag Marketing Services Weekly Hay Report guidelines. So for the acid detergent fiber, which is a measure of the plant cellulose and lignin contents and really does give us a very good indication of the digestibility of that forage, we see that at Boot, we have an acid detergent fiber level that is comparable to a fair quality alfalfa. And of course, along the same note, the crude protein is also right at 16%, which kind of falls at the base of that crude protein guideline for fair quality alfalfa. As we transition into the soft dough stage, at that point, we are really falling into what would be considered a utility forage. And this would be a forage that would be used for a dry cow and would not necessarily be that premium quality forage that would go into milk production. So our beef cattle feedlots or dry cows is where that utility forage would go. And so again, ADF, the digestibility, the lower the value, the higher the digestibility. And so as we consider these things, and you know, and again, using this data could really help with producers as they negotiate these contracts. Regional producers in the High Plains actually have told us over this past year that as they considered negotiating harvest timing with dairies, they did use this data as an example to help with those prices. So as I mentioned, 2020, a distinctly different year from 2019, and we really were looking at the impact of drought stress on the forage yield. And as we consider forage yield, I mentioned that often producers have drought-stressed grain crop that they want to use for silage. And so comparing our forage yield in our 2020 trial with grain plots that are adjacent to our trial, we can really kind of see just a difference in the value at current market prices. So harvesting at soft dough, we looked at for several varieties in our trial, we had yields that range from 3.4 tons per acre to 5.9 tons per acre. Silage right now is bringing about $42 a ton. And so we can see on an acre basis, we're looking at right at $246 per acre on a gross price to right at $141 per acre. In comparison, because of the heat and the water stress as we moved from anthesis into grain fill, we had very poor grain fill, very low yield potential on this field. And our yields ranged anywhere from 16.7 bushels per acre to right at 28 bushels per acre. So comparing the price of the grain at on average $4.50 per bushel, we're seeing that the gross difference can be anywhere from $42 per acre up to $163 per acre. So looking at that average, we can really see why, in many cases, it does make sense for a farmer who has drought-stressed grain to potentially consider chopping that field for silage if there is a dairy or a feedlot locally where they can take that to. Of course, because of the transport cost and the fact that when we're hauling silage, we're hauling water, and those freight bills can really add up. We're not going to be hauling this a long distance. So it really does benefit producers who are within a close proximity to a concentrated feeding operation, whether it's a dairy or a forage, and they can haul this and they can really take advantage of some of the profit potential that a forage can bring in comparison to a grain if it's a low yielding field, and especially at the current lower commodity prices. Now, of course, I mentioned boot is often desired by the dairies because of the quality that we previously spoke about. When we look at the yield on a dry matter basis at boot, we see that boot yield is anywhere from about 2.2 to anywhere right at 3 tons per acre on a dry matter basis. So considering the same price at $42 per ton, we've really dropped the gross return on that acreage quite a bit. We're now looking at anywhere from about $90 to $130 per acre. And so at this point, we see that looking at that gross difference between the grain yield and the forage, that we're really losing the profit potential by harvesting at boot. And so it does become, as you're looking at this, you have to consider, what is your harvest cost going to be? Now possibly if the dairy was going to pay for the chopping cost and the transportation, and you had a variety that it paid better to take this, maybe you could negotiate a higher cost because of the quality, that might make sense. But again, for producers who are fulfilling contracts for dairies who are requesting boot, but the dairy is not compensating them for that quality, are potentially, coming out behind, or definitely not very far ahead, not considering the cost of the freight and the lost tonnage they would have by harvesting at soft dough. So looking at the 2020 yields just by variety, we see again, once we're at boot, we really do not have that big difference in yield potential between our varieties. But as we transition from the boot into the soft dough stage, where we are looking at that weaklage, that's where we really start to see those variety differences stand out. But one thing that I do want to point out that as we look at this, our forage production can come at the expense of our grain production. And so this really stands out in a low water environment in drought years. And this year, this is exactly what we saw. We had two high yielding forage varieties, TAM 114 and Westbred 4792, but the grain yield in those plots were 18 bushels per acre and 17 bushels per acre. And of course, we can see by these error bars that just represent the variability across our different plots. There's actually quite a bit of variability, and it was due to the drought stress that was in this field. However, here's a variety that was a high yielding variety in this field, 28 bushels per acre, but it just didn't necessarily have the forage. So that is something that's important to think about as we're looking at managing varieties. Sometimes forage production can come at the expense of grain production. Something that we have done, and data that I'm not showing, is actually looking at seeding rates and how can we adjust our seeding rates so that we can potentially not lose grain production at the expense of forage production, or where are we going to really find that sweet spot and meet in the middle between the two. So, of course, quality is significantly affected by environment. I previously showed you the data from 2019, and the data from 2019 was, a really nice textbook example of the response and protein to growth stages. And what we saw in 2020, because of the conditions, we did not have as significant of a difference between the two stages. Looking at boot, it was actually quite variable. There was much more variety response between in our crude protein, but we saw that we were anywhere from about 13 to 16% crude protein at boot. And then by the time we dropped down to early soft dough, our crude protein was on average about 11 to 13%. Now, of course, our crude protein was higher at soft dough in 2020 because of the drought. And that is because we were concentrating those resources in that reduced production potential. Of course, one of the downsides to this, and we did not measure nitrate levels, but there is always the concern of nitrate accumulations, not necessarily as much in wheat as there is in our summer annuals, but nevertheless, that's why we see those higher crude protein levels, is because of the accumulation, and the nitrogen is not diluted over a greater tonnage. And really see the same thing with the ADF. And again, the ADF, the acid detergent fiber, which is a measure of the cellulose and lignin and gives us a very good indication of the digestibility of that forage. There's really not a whole lot of difference because of the environmental stress that was in this field. On average, we're looking at about 30% ADF for both boot and early soft dough across all of the varieties. Now, relative feed value is an index that is used that accounts for the digestibility, and it accounts for the acid detergent fiber as well as the neutral detergent fiber, which is an indication of the intake. And so that relative feed value becomes a very good indication of forage quality that's used in alfalfa, and, as well as our small grains. And so looking at just the relative feed value for various alfalfa maturity stages and hay grades, we see that what would be considered a hay grade of a 2, which would be alfalfa that would be at 50% bloom, we're looking at a relative feed value of about 103 to 124. And so we can see that for our wheat silage here, from even boot even into early soft dough, that we are still maintaining that relative feed value. So again, this is something to think about as you're potentially negotiating those contracts and thinking about those prices, is that even as we move into soft dough, we can still maintain that relative feed value. Of course, that will vary, and it is why it is always important to just grab a forage sample from your field. And that's something that when you think about, just a general forage sample might cost you $10 to $15, and local labs can process that, and that is something that you can use as you're looking at how you're pricing this. So looking at the moisture, again, because of the year, this is something that was very distinct. At boot, we were about 75 to 80%, not too far off from last year, although we were slightly drier. However, once we made it to soft dough, we had actually dropped below 60%. So we were kind of approaching the drier end of the spectrum. And this is something that if a commercial chopper was coming in and they had gotten behind, and they were a few days behind, and as warm as it was, we were looking at temperatures that were in the upper 90s at this point, with high winds that were drying out fields, we probably would have been too wet in the next 2 to 3 days to chop for silage. And so at that point, it probably would have been a field that would have been best to go to hay rather than be chopped for silage. So again, 2020 was just this perfect example of heat and water stress. And as we compare the yields for several of the varieties that we had in the trials across both years, we see that at boot, even in extreme years coming out of a winter drought, we really did not have that much difference between the yields for most of the varieties between the 2 years. However, as we moved into that soft dough period, that's because of the drought and the heat, we really saw that start to differentiate. So just some key things to wrap this up with as we look at our small grain forages and water stress. the most sensitive stage to heat and moisture stress is going to be late tillering. And of course, that is when we're determining the number of kernels per head. And then as we move into flowering and then into grain fill. And so as we look at this, even though we've talked about the impact on quality, this is also something I do believe that our regional Southern High Plains producers can use to their advantage. In the Texas High Plains, we have producers who are irrigating with well capacities that are less than 3 gallons per minute per acre. In the southwestern panhandle, many producers have dropped down to less than 2 gallons per minute per acre. And I routinely receive calls from farmers who ask, I only have 1 to 2 inches of irrigation that I can apply to my wheat or my forage crop. When would be the best time to apply that? And so of course we want to get that crop established, but as we move into spring, when would be the best time to apply that water? But also, what about let's just harvest early? Let's save some water. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, that the average water use during that boot through grain fill period is very significant. And of course, in the Southern High Plains, we're looking at almost 12 inches of water during this. So if we are in a drought year, or even just a situation where we have limited well capacities, we could potentially use this as an opportunity to harvest earlier, still optimize some contract prices because of the quality. So remember though, again, variety selection is key, and especially if we're looking at harvesting at soft dough, we really start to see those varieties stand out and see those differences with that. So as we just kind of recap, look at the summer 2020 cropping season. Of course, this was NOAA weather outlooks from a couple of weeks ago, but this is really impactful what happened a couple of weeks ago as we look at our summer silage production. In the Texas Panhandle, we have already a significant impact to our corn silage production. We have corn grain fields that are being chopped earlier than intended, not going to grain, but going to silage. And of course, many fields have just burned up, and farmers have split irrigation, concentrated water, and because of this, it's turned out to be a pretty bad situation. And we've looked at how we're moving into a potential forage deficit going into this winter. So, based off of our most recent forecast, even though our conditions across much of the region, we have an equal chance of, normal temperatures and normal precipitation, we're still trying to catch up from several weeks of extreme conditions. And so even with recent rains, the drought persists, especially in this high dairy region in the southwest panhandle and southern Great Plains that has a high forage demand. And so, it's important as we look at this, how are we going to make the summer forage meet that demand? And this is where these winter small grains are really going to be increasingly important, especially this year as they fill that silage gap. So of course, just to wrap it up, we need to know our end users and of course, potentially negotiate on quality so that we can hopefully optimize some profitability on this wheat acreage. With that, does anyone have any questions?
Well, I'm looking over here in the chat function, and folks, remember, if you've got questions, go ahead and click on the chat button, and you can type those in there in the box that comes up. I've got a couple for you, Jourdan. First off, I'm kind of excited about this research because it's one more use for a crop that we love in the plains, and especially in Kansas, right? Now, you talked a lot about the varieties that you studied in this research project that you had up in Colorado and a little bit of northwestern Kansas. They're starting to see some wheat stem sawfly issues, and they're starting to play around with thicker stemmed wheats. Is that something that may be applicable to more southern climates? I mean, could those be used as wheat for wheatlage?
Yeah, that is a great question, and that is a possibility. And of course, when we look at the fact of how important I guess that probably could be for the packing. Now, I will say I don't know enough about the adaptability of those varieties, especially to the Southern Great Plains, and many of the varieties that are bred for those northern climates do not have the heat tolerance that adapt to the Southern Great Plains production environments. And so that's something that's, you know, definitely consideration, but it's definitely a great thought. So it'd be interesting to see.
Okay. Now, what fascinates me as well is we talk about often folks that are in a cover crop situation sometimes use wheat as a cover crop. It hurts my wheat farmer's daughter's heart. However, it is a fact of life. It's another use for wheat. Is this a situation where we could take the top part of the plant off and come back in with another crop, use it as a cover crop essentially?
Well, so yeah, that's something that many producers in the Southern High Plains have started looking at. Of course, they recognize the value of the cover crop, and we want to protect the soil and incorporate that organic matter, but it also doesn't always pay. And when you look at, you have a seed cost and you're terminating, and you know, how are we going to make this pay? There is a forage value to that. Of course, as we remove much of the biomass for silage, you know, it really does become, you know, how much of the biomass are we contributing to the soil health and to that. Of course, we do have the roots, and there still is some biomass depending on the chop height. Many of the choppers, especially in this region, they tend to drop that chopper as low as possible, and they're almost scalping at the ground. You know, possibly producers could work with this, or you know, if they're chopping themselves and have their own chopper and not working with a custom chopper, but work with that custom chopper to leave a longer height and, you know, leave a little bit of residue on the surface. But you know, I do know that's something many producers are considering. You know, how can we make these cover crops profitable and use them more as a dual purpose option themselves?
I really loved how you also brought to mind that there's beef cow and dairy cow considerations here, and what we're looking at essentially is a maintenance for a dry dairy cow, right?
Right. And so, and especially as we move into soft dough and we see those quality values decrease, it really does become more of what would be the quality for a maintenance, you know, that dry cow, or for a beef feedlot, that quality. But at boot, you know, we really do have those higher feed values, and that is something that could go into a heifer, or possibly, depending on how it's balanced within a ration, you know, into a lactating dairy cow ration. And so, you know, that's something that, as we look at the value of it, but farmers are not necessarily getting paid the premium, how are they going to, can they negotiate that? And I do think it's just worth keeping in mind as we consider just current market prices.
We've got a question from Ray. What are ways to increase the protein in wheatlage if there is an incentive for protein? And also, is there a variety that you would recommend for harvest at boot to get protein?
That's a great question. Of course, when we look at protein, so much of the protein is determined by just agronomic management. And I think that, you know, our initial discussion this morning and how he looked at, you know, the protein and the nitrogen applications, that was a really great study. But of course, we want to make sure that we are addressing the nitrogen top dressing time, and, you know, coming in and paying attention to what's in the residual soil, but also, you know, doing some tissue sampling and making sure that we're meeting those nitrogen requirements. As we look at variety differences, and of course, if Ray wants to email me, I'm happy to share that data with him. With crude protein, we really haven't seen difference in the forage separate out that much by variety. The differences in crude protein are more by stage and harvest stage. And so that's something that we really see, it becomes more of an agronomic management function of management. And of course, a response to nitrogen is always going to be dependent on the available water. And that is something that I always like to keep in the back of my head, because there's so much discussion about nitrogen application, and we can put down all the nitrogen in the world, but if we don't have the water to make the yield, that plant is not going to respond to those nitrogen applications.
That also reminds me, Jourdan, this is ideal research for right on top of the Ogallala Aquifer. I mean, we have talked for generations about how to preserve and continue use the aquifer for our agriculture out here, but also understand that we have to have the aquifer around for the next 50 or 60 or 100 years or so. So this actually has a real application to that. In working with 3B Farms, are they seeing some reduction in water use because of, or are they better able to manage their water that they're applying to their wheat? And 3B, if I remember right, they also have watermelon and a few other things going on at their farm, right?
Right. Yes, they are very diversified. And so this data, though, they are actually using with the farmers that they are working with. And so they are an AgriPro seed dealer. And so they are using this data with farmers, and as they discuss their contracts and potentially harvest stages and managing that water. So this is something that's been exciting to see how it has been used, and farmers are helping, or the state is helping farmers make those negotiate their contracts.
Good. Well, remember, folks, get your questions in. One more from me. Texas A&M AgriLife has the picks list, if I remember right, the selections list. So are we going to start seeing some wheat picks for better silage?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. There's been discussion about dual purpose varieties as well. And of course, as we look at wheat, going back to just, I think my initial statement is that we know wheat is a great dual purpose crop. But again, farmers are seeing that they really are needing livestock to help make this system profitable. It becomes a system management. And so they have asked about dual purpose varieties for the picks, and then of course, for silage. So hopefully we can expand this work and provide, more options.
Great. Well, hey, Jourdan, I see that there's no more questions. Any final thoughts that you want to leave people with?
No, of course, we're moving into, setting up our trial for next year, and it'll be interesting to see, as we look at two extreme years, how 2021 will turn out. So hopefully we can share that data.
Well, good luck, and thank you so much for joining us. It's always fun to pick your brain and to learn more about the different ways that we can look at our crops in the High Plains. Thanks to you all for joining us today on this second session of Sorghum and Wheat U. Join us tomorrow for our first session of the day, starting at 9 a.m. We will hear from Josh Lofton of Oklahoma State and Scott Stagenborg of S&W Seeds about sorghum management. We will also have an update from Kansas Sorghum. Before we go, I want to remind you all that registered attendees will receive a survey in their email boxes after Sorghum U and Wheat U is done. As you know, if you're a regular attendee of all of our High Plains Journal U events, that we take the feedback that you provide to us very seriously in creating the next year's event. As you might imagine, we're reinventing our programming right now, and we could sure use your feedback to make sure that we craft not only session topics, but also session platforms that help you. So please let us know how we're doing and what we could be doing better. Now, before we leave you, we have one more message from our session sponsors, BASF. Thank you again, BASF, for helping us bring today's session to our listeners. If you like this format for learning, let us know. And remember, our Cattle U is now going virtual as well. That will be September 8th through the 11th, and you can register for free at cattleu.net. On behalf of all of us here at High Plains Journal, thank you for riding with us. And we'll see you here tomorrow at 9 a.m. for the next session of High Plains Journal's virtual Sorghum U, Wheat U. Thanks and have a great day.
Dirt road in a gooseneck, saddle up with me. Dry land in God's country, crops far as I can see. Headlights on both ends of my day.